Is this the end of Apple as we know it? Bombshell antitrust lawsuit today, and this changes everything. This is the largest antitrust case that we've seen in over 25 years. If you own Apple stock, or if you're considering buying it, you need to watch this video.
Breaking news here on Apple out of the DOJ. Eamon Javers has it. Eamon?
Sarah, this is a civil antitrust lawsuit filed in the United States District Court for the District of New Jersey, and it alleges by the DOJ that Apple illegally maintains a monopoly over smartphones by selectively imposing contractual restrictions on and withholding critical access points from developers.
Now, at first, you might brush this off and say, yeah, this is old news. We already know about the iStore. We know about the saga with Epic Games, the 30%. This is old news, right? Well, wrong. It goes much deeper than that, and they attack Apple from many different angles that I'll get to later in the video. But first, a history lesson. And you might not have even been around in 1998 to know about this. The U.S. Justice Department and attorneys general from 21 states brought an antitrust monopolization lawsuit against Microsoft. This is in 1998. At that time, Microsoft controlled how most consumers and businesses worked on their desktop computers. The primary complaint here is that Microsoft strangled Netscape and essentially made them go out of business. And this case was primarily about Internet Explorer. If the Department of Justice could prove that Microsoft unreasonably made it difficult for consumers to uninstall Internet Explorer and use a competitive browser, that it would be found guilty. So the case with Apple today also deals with the Sherman Antitrust Act. And the ruling said that Microsoft violated parts of this act. And this was established all the way back in 1890 to outlaw monopolies and cartels. Now, he found that Microsoft's position in the marketplace at that time was a monopoly that threatened not only competition, but also innovation in the industry. Listen to this.
The Department of Justice alleges Apple has broken the law, specifically Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act, in 5 specific ways. One, by blocking innovative super apps. They say Apple has disrupted the growth of apps with broad functionality. The second is by suppressing mobile cloud streaming services. They say Apple blocked the development of cloud streaming apps and services that would allow consumers to enjoy what they call high-quality video games and other cloud-based applications without having to pay for expensive smartphone hardware. The third is by excluding cross-platform messaging apps. The Department of Justice says Apple has made the quality of cross-platform messaging worse, less innovative, and less secure for users so that its customers have to keep buying iPhones. The fourth is by diminishing the functionality of non-Apple smartwatches. Apple, they say, has limited the functionality of these third-party smartwatches so that users who purchase the Apple Watch face substantial out-of-pocket costs if they don't keep buying iPhones. And the fifth category here is limiting third-party digital wallets. They say Apple has prevented third-party apps from offering tap-to-pay functionality, inhibiting the creation of cross-platform third-party digital wallets, which, of course, is important in the whole paying ecosystem here. Now, the court process is expected to take months, if not years here. And guys, there's a political overlay to all of this, because if President Biden is to lose to Donald Trump in the fall, it's a Trump Department of Justice that could be in charge of handling the end game of this case, not a Biden one, depending on that election outcome. So it's not at all clear how that would play out. So a lot of moving parts here, guys. But the Department of Justice now suing Apple on antitrust grounds. Back over to you.
All right, so a lot to unpack there. Typically, this conversation has been about Apple and Google. And you think about app stores. Is a duopoly enough for the consumer? Is there enough competition to make the prices inexpensive and to ensure continued innovation? Now, one argument there is, well, you don't have to use either. You can use Apple. It's a choice. You can go in the ecosystem. You can go on Android. It's an ecosystem. There are other alternatives out there, but this case goes much deeper than just the App Store.
Earlier today, the Department of Justice, joined by 15 states and the District of Columbia, sued Apple in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey for violating Section 2 of the Sherman Antitrust Act. Over the last 2 decades, Apple has become one of the most valuable public companies in the world. Today, its net income exceeds the individual gross domestic product of more than 100 countries. That is in large part due to the success of the iPhone, Apple's signature smartphone product. For over a decade, iPhone sales have made up a majority of Apple's annual revenue. Today, Apple's share of the U.S. performance smartphone market exceeds 70%, and its share of the entire U.S. smartphone market exceeds 65%. Apple charges as much as nearly $1,600 for an iPhone. But as our complaint alleges, Apple has maintained monopoly power in the smartphone market not simply by staying ahead of the competition on the merits, but by violating federal antitrust law. Consumers should not have to pay higher prices because companies break the law. We allege that Apple has employed a strategy that relies on exclusionary, anti-competitive conduct that hurts both consumers and developers. For consumers, that has meant fewer choices, higher prices and fees, lower quality smartphones, apps, and accessories, and less innovation from Apple and its competitors.
So if you remember earlier, when we talked about Microsoft, what were the two key components? Competition and innovation. And that's exactly what he's talking about here.
For developers, that has meant being forced to play by rules that insulate Apple from competition. And as outlined in our complaint, we allege that Apple has consolidated its monopoly power, not by making its own products better, but by making other products worse. Apple carries out its exclusionary anti-competitive conduct in two principal ways. First, Apple imposes contractual restrictions and fees that limit the features and functionality that developers can offer iPhone users. Second, Apple selectively restricts access to the points of connection between third-party apps and the iPhone's operating system, degrading the functionality of non-Apple apps and accessories. As a result, for most of the past 15 years, Apple has collected a tax in the form of a 30% commission on the price of any app downloaded from the App Store, as well as on in-app purchases. Apple is able to command these fees from companies of all sizes. Apple has also suppressed the emergence of programs like cloud streaming apps, including gaming apps, as well as super apps that could reduce user dependence on Apple's own operating system and expensive hardware. And as any iPhone user who has ever seen a green text message or received a tiny, grainy video can attest, Apple's anti-competitive conduct also includes making it more difficult for iPhone users to message with users of non-Apple products. It does this by diminishing the functionality of its own messaging app and by diminishing the functionality of third-party messaging apps. By doing so, Apple knowingly and deliberately degrades quality, privacy, and security for its users. For example, if an iPhone user messages a non-iPhone user in Apple Messages, the text appears not only as a green bubble, but incorporates limited functionality.
Now, this goes on for a while. He rips Apple for another 10 minutes, and other people even come to the podium and rip on Apple. Apple did issue a statement before this press conference in its defense, and I want you to hear this as well.
Yeah, David, actually got a statement here from Apple responding to the DOJ's lawsuit. I'll go ahead and read it out loud here for you. Quote, "At Apple, we innovate every day to make technology people love, designing products that work seamlessly together, protect people's privacy and security, and create a magical experience for our users. This lawsuit threatens who we are and the principles that set Apple products apart in the fiercely competitive markets. If successful, it would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. It would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering government to take a heavy hand in designing people's technology. We believe this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will vigorously defend it." But some interesting stuff on the super apps that Eamon was just mentioning. This lawsuit doesn't appear to go after the App Store directly as a whole. Instead, it's focusing on the super apps that Eamon was describing. We've seen this lawsuit between Epic Games and Apple kind of play out through the courts and basically kind of answered the question about Apple's App Store policies, the fees it charges, and so on and so forth, being the only exclusive way to download software to the iPhone. We've seen what happened with that in Europe, but that doesn't seem, at least right now, based on these excerpts I have, that doesn't seem to be what the DOJ is chasing. They're not proposing here saying, you know, there needs to be another kind of app store or anything like that. I would also point to the messaging thing. I know Eamon talked about this a little bit, but basically making the argument that by keeping iMessage sort of exclusive and degrading maybe the regular text message experience, that is anti-competitive. They use an example of what if you buy your kids an Android phone and you can't really talk to them as seamlessly as you could if you bought them an iPhone and things like that. And also the cloud streaming apps. This is another concession we've seen Apple make in the European Union, allowing services like Microsoft's Xbox cloud streaming service on those devices. So that could be one potential easy concession. Same with the payments. They made the same concession in the EU already, letting third-party apps access that near field communication chip for those tap-to-pay mobile payments guys. So a little bit of difference between what the EU is attacking Apple for and what we're seeing here in this DOJ case. But of course, we got to read through the whole thing, guys.
All right, so this is a Pandora's box, and it could take years, as mentioned earlier. It could take years before we know what happens with this case. I'm going to give you my thoughts on how this might play out and how it might impact Apple stock. Now, before I do that, do me a favor as I continue, drop me a comment below and let me know what you think. Is this something that scares you out of Apple stock? Do you think that Apple's going to lose this lawsuit? Tell me what you think is going to happen. So let's dig into this more and talk about what could happen to Apple. Before we do that, what happened to Microsoft back in 1998? So Microsoft appealed the decision. The company took issue with the judge's position, citing bias in favor of the prosecution. The appeals court overturned Jackson's decision against Microsoft. Instead of seeking to break up the company, the DOJ decided to settle with Microsoft. In return, Microsoft agreed to share computing interfaces with other companies. Now, what's interesting with this ruling is it got Microsoft out of jail, so to speak, but it also allowed Apple to become Apple. Without going down that rabbit hole in a nutshell, if this didn't happen, Apple would have never became Apple. Devices like the iPod and the iPhone could have never become as huge as they are today. So we have an idea of what can happen with some of these items because the European Union have already gone after Apple, and we know how those played out. You could certainly see the App Store, for example, that 30% could be reduced. Now, if you dig into the 30%, it's not 30% across the board, and there are circumstances where some companies don't pay that. There's a lot that goes into that. Also, that 30% includes processing fees. Now, if you listen to that press conference, it's talking about the iPhone being too expensive at $1,600. If you have an Apple Watch, how it won't integrate unless you have an iPhone. It's talking about how Apple built an ecosystem. And honestly, it's one of those things with capitalism. If you're too good at something, you end up getting punished. Apple's really good with its ecosystem. And once it gets you in the ecosystem, it's very sticky. And I'm definitely proof of that. The entire company of Fired Up Wealth, everything I produce, every video I've ever made, it's all on Apple devices. And Apple allowed me to create videos with no experience using Final Cut Pro. If it weren't for Apple and its ecosystem and Final Cut Pro, I wouldn't be talking to you today. Now, I've owned the stock since 2015, and I do like the company. It's done well for me. It's paid its shareholders back with dividends and buybacks. Antitrust suits like this, it takes a long time for them to play out. It might be years before we hear anything. And you've heard about lawsuits against all the mega cap tech companies, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. You've heard about all of them. Could something happen to Apple? Could Apple be broken up from this? I think it's possible, but I think there's a strong chance that Apple isn't broken up. I think Apple will probably settle, probably pay some fines, and probably have to change how it does business in a few different areas. For example, text messaging. I look at that, I see it as a business person. I look at that and say, well, it makes sense. I'm trying to create an ecosystem where my products work best together, and I'm trying to keep the competition out. So that strategy that's given shareholders magnificent returns over the past decade plus, it's allowed Apple to become the behemoth it is, but antitrust is basically saying, hey, you guys are getting too big. You have too much power. I would argue, is Apple really a monopoly or is it more of a duopoly? I can see both sides of this. And I try to remain neutral. Even though I own the stock, I'm up on it, 500% or whatever it is. I've been saying to the gang in Discord for a while, I don't think Apple should be worth more than $150 a share. Now, it was only down 3-4% earlier today, last time I looked, and it's still trading around $170 a share. Could the stock see more pressure and go lower? I think the answer is absolutely. Now, what's interesting is Apple has been the market darling that allows the market to go higher. And earlier today, you saw basically everything green except for a handful of stocks, including Apple. So Apple may no longer be a market leader. And maybe it doesn't have to be because companies like NVIDIA are stepping up its game. Now, you look at NVIDIA, for example, you could easily say that NVIDIA is creating a monopoly, and you'll probably see antitrust violations against NVIDIA and lawsuits down the road as well. So I'm torn on it because as a capitalist, I want to see companies do what's best for their business and their shareholders. And what's interesting about it is you see people on the internet complain about Apple. A lot of times those are the same people that don't want government intervention. Now, if Apple loses this case, it creates a precedent, and you could see a lot of these other mega cap tech companies be hit by it. This has been one of the risks of investing in these companies for years. You look at like Meta, for example, that's been the risk for 4 or 5 years that I can remember. So right now, we just don't know all the details. It's something that we're going to have to watch closely and monitor, and I'll continue to bring developments to you. If this video is helpful, please subscribe to the channel if you're new here. Click that bell for notifications. Drop me a like, drop me a comment. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.